10-year-old boy selling lemonade at midnight, alone, silent, watching the shadows like they might swallow him whole. When Shaq stops to buy a cup, he expects a simple answer. But Noah won't say why he's really there, why his hands shake when he takes the money, why his eyes dart to the dark street behind him. Then Shaq sees him, the man in the shadows, watching, waiting. Noah isn't just selling lemonade. He's surviving. And Shaq? He's about to change everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The city was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual hum of life, distant car horns, the chatter of late-night stragglers had faded into an eerie stillness. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows over the empty sidewalks. Shaq drove with one hand on the wheel, his other tapping absently against the leather console. He had just wrapped up a late business meeting, another deal finalized, another long night on the road. Then, he saw it. A small stand, barely noticeable in the dim light. And behind it, a boy. Shaq slowed the car, frowning. A kid, no older than 10, stood on the sidewalk, a worn-out hoodie swallowing his small frame. His hands were tucked into his sleeves, his posture stiff, as if he were bracing himself against the cold, or against something worse. On the table in front of him sat a plastic jug of lemonade, a few paper cups, and a makeshift sign scrawled in marker. 50 cents a cup. Shaq checked the time on the dashboard. 11:57 p.m. Why the hell was a child out here at midnight, selling lemonade? Curiosity gnawed at him. This wasn't normal. Without thinking, Shaq pulled the car over and stepped out. Noah noticed him immediately. His small hands tightened around the table's edge, and for a split second, Shaq saw it. Fear. Not the kind of fear kids had when they got caught staying up past bedtime. Real fear. Deep fear. The kind that makes you watch every shadow. But just as quickly, the boy masked it. "Lemonade, sir?" Noah asked, his voice polite but too rehearsed. Shaq studied him. His clothes were old, his sneakers scuffed, his hoodie a size too big. Dark circles clung under his eyes, exhaustion written all over his young face. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a 20. "I'll take a cup." Noah's eyes widened. He quickly grabbed a cup, poured the lemonade with careful precision, and handed it over. His fingers trembled slightly. Shaq took a sip. Warm. Too much sugar. But he barely noticed. He handed Noah the 20. "Keep the change." For a second, Noah just stared at the bill. Then he hesitated. It was small, but Shaq caught it. The way Noah's fingers hovered before snatching the money and shoving it into his pocket, like he was scared someone would take it from him. Shaq leaned against his car. Late night for a lemonade stand. Noah shrugged. "Yeah, business is slow." "You always out here this late?" Another shrug. "Sometimes." Shaq took another sip, watching the boy carefully. "Your folks okay with that?" For the first time, Noah faltered. It was the briefest crack in the armor, but it was there. He dropped his gaze, fingers fiddling with the rim of the lemonade jug. "They don't mind." Lying. Shaq had been around too many people. Powerful men, criminals, businessmen who twisted the truth like a second language. He knew a lie when he heard one, but this wasn't a slick lie. This was a scared kid trying to make a grown-up problem disappear. Shaq exhaled, placing the half-empty cup on the table. "Where do you live, kid?" Noah stiffened. "Nearby." Shaq tilted his head. "You sure?" Noah forced a smile. Too forced. "Yeah." Shaq didn't push. Not yet. Instead, he glanced down the street. There were no other kids, no parents, no one watching over him. Just him, alone, selling lemonade in the middle of the night. Something wasn't right. After a few more seconds of silence, Noah straightened. "I should probably pack up soon." Shaq nodded slowly. "Yeah, probably." But he didn't move. Instead, he watched as Noah's eyes darted. Left, right, down the street. Not like a kid wrapping up a lemonade stand. Like a kid waiting for something. Or someone. Shaq turned slightly, following Noah's gaze. Across the street, half hidden in the shadows near a dark alley, stood a man, tall, still, watching. Shaq felt his pulse tick up. When he turned back, Noah was already shoving things into his bag. "Who's that?" Shaq asked, nodding toward the figure. Noah's fingers fumbled as he stuffed the money into his pocket. No one. Lying. Again. Shaq's jaw clenched. Noah slung his backpack over his shoulder, grabbing the lemonade jug. His movements were rushed, almost panicked. "I should go," he mumbled. "Thanks for buying." He turned quickly, his small frame disappearing into the night. Shaq didn't stop him, but his eyes stayed on the man across the street. The man stayed still, watching. Then, after a few moments, he turned and walked away. Shaq exhaled slowly, his gut tight with suspicion. Noah wasn't just a kid selling lemonade. He was hiding something, and someone was watching him. Shaq got back in his car, gripping the steering wheel. He had a choice: drive away, or find out the truth. As he looked in his rearview mirror, watching Noah's small figure disappear down the dark street, Shaq knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The next night, Shaq found himself driving down the same street again, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the unsettling image of a 10-year-old kid standing alone at midnight, selling lemonade as if his life depended on it. Whatever the reason, Shaq slowed the car as he approached the familiar spot, and there he was. Noah stood at the same corner, his small lemonade stand looking no different from the night before. The plastic jug was still half full, the sign still slightly crooked, and the cups still stacked neatly in a pile. But Shaq noticed the details now. The way Noah's hoodie sleeves were pulled over his hands, as if he were trying to make himself smaller. The way his eyes darted toward every passing car. The way he hunched his shoulders like he was bracing for something. Shaq parked across the street and stepped out, this time not in a rush. He walked over slowly, watching as Noah noticed him. There was a flicker of recognition in the boy's eyes, but it was gone just as fast. He straightened up, forcing the same polite, practiced expression. "Lemonade?" Noah asked, his voice even, almost robotic. Shaq nodded but didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he leaned against the table, his eyes steady on the boy. "Are you always out here this late?" Noah shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Yeah. Business is slow." Shaq didn't miss the way his fingers clenched the edge of the table. "Ever think about selling during the day? Probably make more money." Noah's jaw tensed, and for the first time, there was hesitation in his response. "I can't." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Noah stayed quiet, his hands tightening into fists. Then, as if realizing he was giving too much away, he quickly shook his head. "I just can't. It's complicated." That was the first crack. Shaq didn't press. Not yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another 20, just like last time. He placed it on the table, watching Noah's reaction. The boy hesitated again. Not like a kid who had been taught to be polite. Not like a kid who didn't want to accept charity. This hesitation was different, like he was afraid to take it. Shaq leaned in slightly. "Noah, what's the money for?" The boy's breath caught, just for a second. Then his face hardened. "Nothing. Just stuff." Shaq studied him. "Important stuff?" Noah nodded but didn't elaborate. Shaq let the silence stretch between them, watching as the boy shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. He wasn't sure if Noah was about to run, lie, or finally crack and tell the truth. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Shaq saw movement. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing across the street near a lamppost. Someone was watching. Shaq's body tensed, his instincts kicking in immediately. He kept his expression neutral, but his focus sharpened. The man in the shadows wasn't just casually passing by. He wasn't out for a late-night walk. He was waiting. And more importantly, Noah knew it. The boy was suddenly packing up his things faster than before, his hands moving with urgency. His entire demeanor changed. No longer slow, tired movements, but rushed, panicked. Shaq straightened. "Who is that?" Noah didn't look up. "No one." Lying. Again. Shaq kept his voice even. "Noah." The boy shook his head, gripping the lemonade jug tightly. I have to go. Shaq glanced back toward the shadowy figure. The man hadn't moved, but his presence was too intentional, too deliberate. He wasn't here by accident, and neither was Noah. Shaq stepped back, letting the boy finish packing, but his mind was already running through possibilities. This wasn't just a struggling kid trying to make a few bucks. This wasn't just a late-night lemonade stand. This was something else. As Noah turned to leave, Shaq called after him. Be careful, kid. Noah hesitated, his back still turned. For a brief second it seemed like he might say something, like he wanted to. But instead, he simply nodded and disappeared down the sidewalk, his small frame swallowed by the darkness. Shaq waited. He stayed there, leaning against his car, watching as Noah rounded the corner and vanished from sight. Then, slowly, his gaze shifted back to the man in the shadows. The man was still standing there, still watching. But now, he was watching Shaq. For the first time since he'd stopped at that lemonade stand, Shaq felt something settle in his gut, something he didn't like. Noah wasn't just selling lemonade. He was being watched. And now, so was Shaq. Shaq had spent years trusting his instincts. It was what made him a successful businessman, reading people, knowing when something felt off. And right now, everything about this felt wrong. Noah had rushed off in a panic, his small frame disappearing into the night. But Shaq wasn't about to let this go. He followed from a distance, keeping his footsteps quiet, his presence hidden in the shadows. The city was silent at this hour, the streetlights flickering against cracked pavement. Up ahead, Noah moved quickly, his sneakers barely making a sound against the concrete. His little lemonade stand was packed into his backpack, the jug of leftover lemonade dangling from his hand. He didn't look around. He didn't hesitate. He just kept moving. Shaq's jaw clenched. This wasn't just a kid going home. This was a kid running. Then, Noah turned a corner, slipping into the parking lot of a rundown motel. Shaq stopped, watching from behind a row of parked cars. The motel was the kind of place people went when they had nowhere else to go. The neon sign buzzed weakly, half the letters burnt out, flickering like it was barely clinging to life. Just like the people inside. Noah reached the door, his hand gripping the handle. But before he could go inside, a man stepped out of the shadows. Tall, rough, dangerous. Shaq's entire body tensed. The man was waiting. He hadn't just stumbled outside by accident. He had been expecting Noah. Noah froze. The man tilted his head slightly, the dim motel light barely catching his face. Gaunt cheeks, cold eyes, a smirk that didn't belong on someone looking at a child. Shaq edged closer, staying in the dark, his fists clenching at his sides. Then, the man spoke. His voice was low, sharp, dangerous. You got it? Noah hesitated. Then quickly he nodded and pulled out the money. Shaq watched as the boy handed over every last dollar he had made that night. His lemonade stand, the long hours, the exhaustion in his small frame, all of it, just to hand over the money to this man. Shaq's blood boiled. This wasn't a parent. This was something worse. The man snatched the money without counting it. He tucked it into his pocket, then crouched slightly so he was eye level with Noah. You better hope this is enough, he murmured, his voice dripping with warning. Noah didn't move, didn't flinch, just nodded. The man's smirk widened like he enjoyed the power he held over the boy. Then he straightened, turning toward the parking lot. Shaq had seen enough. He stepped forward. The man barely had time to react before Shaq's broad frame was blocking his path. What do you want with the kid? Shaq's voice was calm, controlled. But underneath, a storm was brewing. The man stopped short, blinking up at him. He wasn't small, not by a long shot, but compared to Shaq he looked like a twig. Still, he recovered fast. A slow, amused smirk spread across his face. Stay out of this, big guy, the man drawled, shoving his hands into his pockets. You don't know what you're stepping into. Shaq tilted his head slightly. Then why don't you tell me? The man chuckled, shaking his head. Ain't your business. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. It is now. That wiped the smirk off the man's face. For the first time, he actually looked at Shaq. Really looked. Like he was realizing this wasn't just some guy asking questions. This was a man who wasn't backing down. For a long moment, the two stood there, sizing each other up. Shaq saw the way the man's fingers twitched inside his pocket, itching to grab something. Maybe a knife, maybe a switchblade. Shaq didn't flinch, didn't move, just stared him down. Then, the man scoffed. "Whatever, man. Do yourself a favor and walk away." He turned, heading toward the parking lot. Shaq let him go. For now. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. Once the man disappeared into a black car and drove off, Shaq turned back toward the motel. Noah was still standing by the door, his small hands clenched at his sides. He had watched the whole thing, quiet, unmoving. Shaq took a slow breath, forcing himself to relax before approaching. "You okay, kid?" Noah swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Yeah." Lying. Again. Shaq looked at the door. "Who's inside?" Noah hesitated. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, he said, "My mom." Shaq exhaled. Finally, a piece of the truth. He crouched slightly, meeting Noah's tired eyes. "That guy. What does he want from you?" Noah dropped his gaze. "Money," he muttered. Shaq's jaw tightened. "Why?" Noah shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know." Lying. Shaq let the silence stretch. Then softly he asked, "Is your mom okay?" Noah's lower lip trembled, and for the first time, he looked like a kid. A scared, tired, helpless kid carrying the weight of something too heavy for him. Finally, in a small, broken voice, he whispered, "I don't know." Shaq clenched his fists. This wasn't just a bad situation. This was something worse, and he wasn't about to let it continue. Noah might have been used to people walking away, but Shaq? He was just getting started. Shaq had spent the night turning things over in his mind, but no matter how he looked at it, the math didn't add up. A 10-year-old kid selling lemonade at midnight. A man lurking in the shadows, collecting his money. A rundown motel that smelled of desperation. Something was wrong. And now, he was going to find out exactly what. Shaq pulled into the motel parking lot the next afternoon, scanning the area. The place looked even worse in daylight. Cracked pavement, rusted railings, cigarette butts scattered near the entrance. The kind of place where people disappeared, and no one asked questions. Noah was outside, sitting on the curb, his backpack beside him. His hands were in his lap, fingers twisting together, his shoulders hunched forward like he was carrying a weight too heavy for someone his size. Shaq got out of the car and walked over. Noah didn't look up. "You back at work?" Shaq asked, nodding toward the backpack. Noah let out a humorless chuckle. "Business is slow." It was a joke, but his voice was too hollow to sell it. Shaq sat down next to him, resting his arms on his knees. They sat in silence for a moment, watching a motel guest shove a broken vending machine before giving up and walking away. Then Shaq said, "You ready to tell me the truth?" Noah stiffened. For a second, it looked like he might run, like he might throw up another lie, another excuse, and disappear into the motel. But then, his shoulders dropped, like he was too tired to fight anymore. He took a slow breath, then finally said, "My mom's inside." Shaq nodded, waiting. "She's sick," Noah continued, his voice quieter now. She can't work, can barely move most days. I try to help, but..." He let out a shaky breath. "It's not enough." Shaq's jaw tightened. Noah wasn't selling lemonade for pocket change. He was trying to save his mother. Shaq turned slightly, looking at the motel room doors. "That guy from last night, he live here too?" Noah's fingers clenched into fists. He nodded. Shaq kept his voice steady. "Who is he?" For the first time, Noah's expression darkened. His jaw tensed, his small hands tightening like he wanted to punch something. "He's my mom's boyfriend." The word came out bitter, like it left a bad taste in his mouth. At least that's what he tells people. Shaq exhaled slowly. Now it made sense. The fear, the secrecy, the way Noah never once mentioned his father. He wasn't just dealing with a sick mom. He was dealing with a man who had taken over their lives. "He takes everything," Noah muttered, staring at the ground. Whatever money we get, it goes to him. If she gets worse, he says it's not his problem. If I don't make enough, he gets mad. Shaq's stomach twisted. He ever put hands on you? He asked carefully. Noah hesitated. That was answer enough. Shaq clenched his fists, keeping his breathing steady. He had seen parasites like this before, men who latched onto vulnerable women, who drained them until there was nothing left, who used fear like a leash. And this one? He was using a 10-year-old kid. Shaq straightened, his voice calm but firm. I want to meet your mom. Noah's eyes widened. He looked at Shaq like he had just suggested jumping into a shark tank. No, Noah said immediately, shaking his head. You can't. If he sees you. Shaq cut him off. I can handle him. Noah's expression flickered with something. Doubt, hope, maybe both. Then slowly, he stood up. She's inside. The motel room smelled like stale air and cheap cleaning products. The curtains were drawn, the only light coming from an old lamp in the corner. And there, lying on the bed, was Noah's mother. She was young, too young to look this tired. Her hair, once probably a rich brown, hung in dull waves over her thin shoulders. Her eyes, hollow with exhaustion, flickered toward Shaq as he stepped inside. For a second, she looked afraid. Then she looked at Noah, and her shoulders relaxed slightly. Noah, she murmured.